Okay, so today our lesson is going to be over integers, and we're just going to call it our intro to integers. So we're going to talk about, what an integer is. We're going to talk about some real world terms. And if you would maybe flip back in your journal, we have some notes over what an integer is. So let's look at our notes really quickly to talk about what is an integer. Remember, an integer is are whole numbers and their opposites. So whole numbers are anything within this part of our Venn diagram. So 1 would be considered a whole number. 0 would be considered a whole number. So an integer is a whole number and their opposites. So not only these whole numbers, but now we're talking about opposites of a whole number. So -3 would be an integer. I want you to really quickly think in your head, would 0 be considered an integer? Hopefully you said yes. Anything within this section of our Venn diagram would be considered an integer. So we're talking about whole numbers and their opposites when we're talking about our lesson today. So let's talk about some real world terms, maybe where you might see some real world integers. Real world terms. And what we're going to do, I'm just going to split mine down the middle, and I'm going to put the negative terms over here, and that's going to be my negative for negative integers. And I'm going to put my positive integers over here, the words for positive integers. And honestly, it's kind of like a number line, right? Negative things go to the left on my number line, positive things go to the right on my number line. So that's kind of why I'm doing that. So let's talk through some negative things, negative terms for real world integers. Anybody ever been to somewhere where it's really, really cold? I don't know if you have or not. I've been to Russia a few times. So in Russia, it's really, really cold. So it might be -34 degrees. That's going to be a negative integer in a real world setting. Really, really cold. So other words would be negative. You might see words like debt. So that means when you owe money to someone, that's a negative number. That's an integer. Maybe you think of debit. Debt and debit are not the same thing. Debt is when you owe money to someone. Debit is when you take a card and you make a debit at the store. Technically, you're taking money out of your bank account, so it's still negative. What about those of you who play football? So if you play football, a loss of yards is technically a negative integer, a loss of yards. And then there's one more. If you have a city that's below sea level, then that would be definitely a negative integer. Positive integers are going to have the same type of words, but really they're just going to be the opposite of that. I do want to add one more, maybe over here. Let's add liability to the negative side. Liability is a financial term. Basically, that means when you owe money on something. So let's say a financial liability is something that you owe debt on. So maybe some college loans or a house mortgage. That would be a liability, and it would also be a negative number. Okay? So let's talk through the positive parts. Positive, if -34 degrees is a negative integer, then let's say it's 73 degrees outside. That would be a positive integer. Also the word positive. Very good. Let's talk through if loss of yards is negative, then if you gain yards on the play, that's going to be a positive integer. If below sea level is negative, then what's going to be the positive part? Hopefully you thought about above sea level. A little C there, okay? And then the opposite of a liability, if you own something that has value, okay, that's called a financial asset. Those are good things. So let's say you own a diamond ring that is worth a certain amount of money. That's a financial asset. And the opposite of maybe debit, right, would be a deposit. If you're putting money in to your bank account, you'd be making a deposit. Okay? So real quick, let's kind of just look through some other terms. One of the biggest terms that we need to know with integers is absolute value. So here's what absolute value is. Absolute value is a number, a number's distance from 0. Okay, a number's distance from 0. And because it's a distance, it's always going to be positive. So I'm going to put that in some parentheses here. Always positive. We don't say when we drive to Houston that we drove 60 miles there and negative 60 miles back, right? We always just say we drove 60 miles. That's because distance is always positive. So let's make ourselves a number line. So go ahead and draw a number line because you should be writing with me in your journal. And we're going to talk through this number line really quickly. So let's have 0's not always in the middle, so we'll start 0 over here. Okay. And then we'll go up to, let's say, maybe 1, 2, 3. And then we'll go backwards, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6. So let's just talk through some things with our number line. As we go from 0 to the right, our numbers get larger on our number line. And they actually, because of this arrow, they would go all the way to positive infinity. They could continue to count and count and count and count and count, right? On the opposite direction, if we're going to the left, our numbers don't get larger, they get smaller. And they would actually go all the way to negative infinity. Just some things to keep in mind when you're looking at number lines, right? So let's talk about absolute value. Absolute value is a number's distance from 0. So if we had the number, and this is how you denote absolute value with some brackets on the side. See these brackets? Those are my absolute value brackets. So if I want to know -4's distance from 0, okay, I want to look at how many jumps it takes me to get from -4 back to 0. How many jumps did that take? Well, it took 4. So the absolute value of -4 is 4, okay? Let's write that in a sentence so we know what kind of happened there. The absolute value of -4 is 4. So that's kind of what this number sentence means. The absolute value of -4 is 4. Same thing, let's do another number. What would be the absolute value of 2? Okay, so how many jumps did it take me to get to 2? A number's distance from 0. Distance is always positive. It just took me 2 jumps. It doesn't matter that I jumped backwards to 0. It's just asking how many spaces did it take me to get there. So always positive. That's going to be helpful when we're doing adding integers. So you're going to want to keep that in mind. Let's do one last example down here at the bottom. And what we're going to do is we're going to order from greatest to least. So I'm going to give you a set of numbers. I'm going to get a pencil. I'm going to give you a set of numbers. We're going to put them on the number line from greatest to least, but the first thing I want to do is just give you this set of numbers. So the set of numbers is going to be -14, 0, -1, 17, 2, and -12.5, okay? Those are not in order. They're not in order from greatest to least. So what we want to do is the easiest way to do that is to create a number line for ourselves. I'm not going to put anything on it just yet, and we'll put them on there as we get going. So let me move this up a little bit so you can see. Okay, so let's start with -14. If I'm thinking about where the rest of these numbers are, -14 is probably going to be somewhere on the smaller end, right? So -14, so we got that one. 0 is going to then be to the right somewhere of -14, and it's not going to be right here because it's not -13, so I'm going to put it over here somewhere, 0. Comparatively to 0, -1 is going to go on this side of 0, but is it closer to 0 or is it closer to -14? Hopefully you can see it's going to be closer to 0, -1. +17. +17, I would say, here's 0, probably going to be way over here somewhere, right? +17. +2, so here's 0, here's +17. Hopefully you're going to see that +2 would go here somewhere. And then -12 is going to be between -1 and -14. Think about where it would go in this instance. Would it go closer to -1 or would it go closer to -14? Hopefully you see that it would be closer to -14. Here's the kicker, because if we go back to this question, it says to list my numbers in order from greatest to least. Are these left to right greatest to least? They are not. A number line naturally is least to greatest, so I have to rewrite them as greatest to least. So let's do that. If I'm writing them greatest to least, it's going to look like 17, got that one, 2, 0, -1, -12.5. -14. All right, so make sure that we are familiar with these words. Make sure that we know the term absolute value, because starting really soon, we're going into integer operations.